This morning it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Michael Minkov. He is professor of the Sofia University. He is the author of books, well-known books, the co-author of one of the books, Cultures and Organizations, with Professor Hofstede, who talked to us last night. Also, he is the author of another book called, and here I forgot, Globalizing.
I'll show some.
Yes, yes. Okay, so we will get the book. Too much information here. Yeah. Anyway, my great pleasure. We are happy that you're here.
First of all, I would like to thank this university and Władek and his team personally for this invitation, because I really appreciate it, because this is my first time in Poland. I must admit that I am ashamed to make this statement, because I think that for an intellectual, for an educated person my age who has traveled so much, it's really shameful not to have been in Poland. So I really appreciate this, and I promise to find a reason to come back again and see more of Poland. This is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much. My presentation is about differences in response style and social polarization, and I will try to explain what this is about and why this is interesting. It seems like a very technical issue. Cross-cultural psychologists deal with this response style, but I will explain very briefly what they have in mind and why this is interesting, and why this has far-reaching conclusions. These differences in response style can indicate very interesting differences between nations in terms of national culture. As you see, you may wonder why I'm showing these pictures. This is an illustration of what is going on in Egypt, a country with very high social polarization in terms of large percentages of the population who have a particular opinion of what is going on in the country and what is good and bad, versus also high percentages of people who hold a totally radical opinion. You see supporters of the deposed president, Mursi, versus supporters of the new hero of the nation, the General, what was his name? Sisi, yeah, exactly. And when I say polarization, it's not just difference in opinion. A couple of days ago, supporters of Mursi were demonstrating in the streets, and these people, the supporters of Sisi, started throwing stones at them. So this is what polarization in Egyptian society means. It's very serious. It's not just I have a different opinion from yours. It also translates into action. Now, it all starts with an observation that cross-cultural psychologists made a long time ago. One of the first, if not the first one, was Professor Hofstede in his research. He found that when you ask questions about values, what is important to you in your life, in your personal life? How important is religion, free time, work, any of those values that could be important to people? You see an interesting phenomenon. In some nations, people tend to select one end of the scale. If the scale has 5 points, like very important, somewhat important, and so on, people in the Arab world, in Latin America, and in Africa, tend to pick the positive extreme. It seems that everything is very important to them. Not to exactly the same degree, but there's a clear tendency that they will, large percentages of people will gravitate toward that extreme. Very important. And in East Asia, in China, Japan, Korea, you see the opposite phenomenon. You see avoidance of extremes. That doesn't mean that nobody picks an extreme, but it's much, much less pronounced. They prefer the middle of the scale. They prefer to say, somewhat important and not very important. They avoid the extremes. And for a long time, psychologists grappled with this issue. What does this mean and how do we deal with this? Traditional view was that this indicates some kind of noise. If people answer, everything is very important, there must be something wrong with these answers, so you need to do something about this. You need to somehow correct these answers. That's one possible treatment of this issue. But there's also another view that this response style is actually a legitimate dimension of culture. Because if you can calculate national indexes on this response style, the degree to which people tend to select one of the ends of the scale, it turns out that this would correlate with some reported dimensions of culture existing in the literature already. This was found by Peter Smith, who's a well-known British cross-cultural psychologist. Now, let me tell you about my own research. I did this a couple of years ago. I analyzed a lot of databases containing information about different cultures. And one of these is by the Pew Research Center, an American think tank, which studies mostly public opinions in the United States. But every now and then they will go all over the world. They have collaborators all over the world, and they do international studies. And this one was done a couple of times. I present data from 2007, but it's not the only time. They did this in 2002 and then in 2007, and I think they're planning to repeat this. In 2007, they had 47 nations. They asked all kinds of questions, including opinions of what is good and bad. I will give you some examples. They asked the respondents whether they thought that certain things in life in general, or in particular in that country, are good or bad. And the interesting thing is that these are nationally representative samples. In some countries, they say that they're nearly representative of the nation, which means that the answers come mostly from big cities, but still they seem to be close to national representativeness. Now, I picked items about judgments or attitudes. By judgments, I mean, if I asked you, what do you think of your national government? What would your judgment be? Would you say that it's very good, somewhat bad, or very bad? How would you rate your national government on this scale? What would you say about the media? These are the answers. These are the questions that they had in that survey, 2007. What do you think of the national government? What do you think of the media in this country? What do you think of immigrants? Large foreign companies, globalization, use of military force in international affairs, and so on. There are many more. I had 34 items. And it turns out that these items measure different things. If you factor analyze them, you will find that these form different dimensions, which means that they're not about one and the same thing. They're not about one and the same thing. And still, I noticed that there were some interesting tendencies. In some countries, there was this well-known trend. Large percentages of people tended to select the positive extreme, but almost equally large percentages of people tended to select the opposite extreme. which means that in one and the same country, like Egypt, back then in 2007, and basically all Arab countries, including the Palestine territory, it was also included. You see large percentages of people saying, this is very, very good. The national government is very good. The media are doing a very good job, and so on. Immigrants, fine. I have a very good opinion of immigrants. But you also see a very high percentage, like 30, 40%, saying, no, the national government is very bad. The media in this country, very bad. A market economy is very bad. So this is what I call social polarization. Very peculiar response style that had not been reported in the literature before. High percentages saying very good, equally high percentages in the same nation saying very bad. As opposed to other countries, like the East Asian and Southeast Asian countries as well, where I noticed that the respondents avoided the extremes. Very small percentages would say very bad, very good. They tended to say somewhat good, somewhat bad. Now, why is this so, and what are the implications of this? So this is my definition of social polarization. High percentages answering very good and very bad. And how do I measure it? I multiply percentages who say very good by percentages very bad. Because if you have 90% in a particular country saying this is very good, there isn't much social polarization. There's consensus, right? But in this way, you get maximum social polarization when 50% say very good and 50% say very bad. So you multiply 50 by 50. This is the maximum possible score, 250. Okay? Maximum social polarization. And this is what I got in terms of results. Highest social polarization, Arab countries. Egypt was included. I remember that the Palestinian territory was included, and a couple of other Arab countries. There were some African countries. Pakistan also scored high. The United States somewhat lower, but relatively high relative to other nations. Then Northwestern Europe was in the middle. And lo and behold, Latin America did not exhibit high social polarization. So Latin Americans will give you extreme answers when you ask them about their values, but on these items, there was nothing extreme in Latin America, in Eastern Europe and Southwestern Europe. And in Southeast Asia and East Asia was at the very bottom, you see this peculiar phenomenon. Very low percentages, pick extremes. Almost everybody says either somewhat good, somewhat bad. Now, what does this mean, and why is this so? This was published in a journal of cross-cultural anthropology. It's called Cross-Cultural Research. It's a respected journal of anthropology, mostly read by anthropologists. I'm telling you this because I provide an anthropological interpretation that some of you may not agree with. I was a little apprehensive. I wondered what anthropologists would say. They didn't say anything. They didn't shred it. They didn't praise it. They just said, it's possible. It's a theory. It's a hypothesis. It's possible. There are all kinds of potential explanations, but this is one potential explanation, I think. The role of the traditional economy. You see an interesting contrast between pastoralist economies, herding sheep, cattle. There's probably not much cattle in the Middle East, but sheep definitely, and goats and camels and horses, versus rice cultivation, and in particular, this is known as wet rice cultivation, using a lot of irrigation. How might this account for differences in culture and response style and other differences in culture that I will talk about? Because this is far-reaching. It's not just about social polarization, what people say. This has much more far-reaching consequences. I admit this is a Marxist explanation. I don't know if Marx was the first one, but Marxism definitely makes a link between economic determinants and cultural outcomes. The software of the mind depends on the economy. You know, the American saying, it's the economy stupid. You know, the economy is very important. But it's not just the level of economic development and joblessness that you have in a country. It seems that this is well established in anthropology, by the way. I didn't discover this. I think that I've discovered some details, but this idea that the structure, the type of economy that you have in a particular country determines, at least to some extent, the culture. This is very old in anthropology. So pastoralists have one type of culture. Rice cultivators have another type of culture. This is well known in anthropology. But exactly what differences do we observe? You may have heard of this book, Culture of Honor, by an American cross-cultural psychologist, Nisbet, and his co-author Cohen in 1996. They've published a couple of things, actually, not just this. There are some articles and studies about culture of honor. Now, they've studied pastoralist societies all over the world. They've collected all available data that they could collect. And it turns out that most pastoralist societies, traditionally pastoralist societies, have some things in common. And this is interesting because there are historical data that show that even back in the 30s, even 40s of the previous century, almost all Arab cultures, Arab societies that are nations today, were almost predominantly, or at least 50%, nomadic pastoralists. That was the case in Saudi Arabia. About 50% were nomads. That was the case in Tunisia. It seems to have been the case all over the Arab world, and there was quite a lot of pastoralism also in Afghanistan, all the way to Pakistan. And it seems to stop there. In China, it was not typical of Chinese, Korean, Japanese culture. But in the Arab world, it was quite typical. So I was thinking, is there a legacy of this pastoralist culture? Now, pastoralists are known to compete with, my clan competes with another pastoralist clan for pastures, because the herds move all the time, and you clash with other clans. They also steal each other's livestock. This is well known. They tend to steal from each other, which again creates tension. Additionally, they also clash with farmers because they cross their lands, and farmers don't like that. You can imagine, you're a farmer and you see this enormous herd crossing your lands. How would you react? As a result, pastoralists maintain a culture of what Nisbet calls a culture of honor. You have to be able at any time to stand up and defend yourself. By the way, the purpose of this book, Nisbet and Cohen, is to explain why there's more violence in the southern American states, in the south of the United States, compared to the north. They found that there's more violence in the south. This is their explanation, which many anthropologists find, some even find this ridiculous. So I wouldn't say anything about how well this explains the situation in the States. But there's no doubt that this is the case. These characteristics are true of most pastoralist societies. This is well established in anthropology. They have to be able to stand their ground, to be outspoken and assertive. In some pastoralist societies, it's almost a badge of honor if you know how to quarrel. If you can, stand up and shout at others and call them names and be outspoken and aggressive verbally, and sometimes not just verbally, this is a badge of honor. You have to be outspoken, categorical, and assertive. And this has implications. These are some illustrations of this culture. You see some. Do you recognize this? These are Arabs, but do you recognize the nationality where they are from? Not all Arabs wear this dagger, but this is typical of Yemen. Traditional Yemeni culture. If you're a real man, you have to have this dagger. This shows. See what will happen if you if you disagree with me. I'm exaggerating, of course, but it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor. And here you see some Bedouins armed with rifles. It doesn't mean that they are always aggressive. What this means is that if you clash with them, they will have to stand up and respond. At the other extreme, you have rice cultivators, and rice cultivators are well known for something else. They work together. They maintain very complex irrigation systems that cannot be maintained by a couple of people or one family or even one village. They usually belong to a whole complex of villages. So they all maintain these irrigation systems together. They're quite complex. You have to, at some time, you have to release the water, then you have to block it, and it's quite complex as far as I understand. And they work collectively, and they need harmony. They need harmony to maintain this system. You need a culture of harmony, which means that you cannot be categorical. If you express your opinions, if you have extreme opinions, and if you express them in uncertain terms, it is like this, and I insist, you will probably clash with somebody else's opinion. So you need a culture that allows extremes to be reconciled. And there are a lot of studies that show the Japanese culture, Chinese culture, is characterized by this tendency, this ability to recognize, to reconcile opposites. So if somebody says this is good, somebody else says it's not so good. They try to find some reconciliation, but for this to be possible, you should not start from extreme positions, because if you start from this is very bad, this is very good, this is very good, it's difficult to find a common ground. So you should start from it's somewhat good, somewhat bad. So you have to keep a low profile, and you have to be adaptable and flexible. You have to adapt to other people. You have to accept their values, their beliefs. You have to be a little bit of a chameleon. And there are a lot of studies that confirm this. Now I'm going to show the results of another analysis of a large-scale survey, the World Value Survey. This is a nationally representative study. And by the way, I will leave this presentation here. I don't know if it's possible to make it available to everybody, probably. It's quite large to be sent by, I can't send it to you by email because the volume is enormous, but maybe there's a way to replicate it somehow. I don't know. And the samples are strictly nationally representative. So I used the latest data from 2005, 2008. This is an analysis in my latest book of some particular items. The World Value Survey asks, are you religious or are you an atheist? And I code this religious, atheist. I count percentages who say I'm religious, percentages who say I'm an atheist. How happy are you on a scale? And I count percentages who say very happy, percentages who say I'm not happy. How proud are you of your nation? So proud versus humble. You can generalize. This is a question about national pride, but it strongly correlates with all kinds of other pride. There are questions about family pride. In nations where people are proud of the nation, they're also proud of their families. They're also proud of themselves. Pride seems to be a thing that cuts across different domains. Do you control the things that happen to you or not in your life? Who controls your life? So free, I'm free to act as I please, I control my life, versus constrained, I feel different constraints. There's an interesting question. Do you prefer to be yourself or follow others? I call this adaptable. Adaptable, I prefer to follow others, versus I prefer to be myself. I'm invariant. I'm always myself. I don't change to fit other people's expectations. In a similar item, do you make efforts to live up to your friends' expectations? So I'm consistent, I make efforts to live up to their expectations, versus I'm flexible. It depends on the situation. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And do you trust people or not? So all these are self-descriptions. These are not values. These are self-descriptions. People describe themselves in anonymous surveys. And if you analyze this, if you understand statistics, there are different ways to analyze large data sets, factor analysis, multidimensional scaling. Basically, this is what you get. you get a map of items and subjects. The subjects are countries in this case. And the map shows you distances between the items and between the subjects in such a way that what is close is similar. For example, invariant is similar to proud in the sense that if many people in a particular nation say that I prefer to be always myself, I'm invariant, many people also say I'm very proud of my nation and everything. So these are similar items, they're closely correlated. But whatever is across from at the other extreme, you know, you can see this as a circle. You draw any diagonal and you will find opposites. Invariant and proud is the opposite of atheist and flexible and adaptable. Happy and free and trusting is the opposite of constrained and happy, distrustful. So these are opposites and these are also opposites. Okay? And you see that I only have some big important countries here because I don't want to overload the slide with too many countries. But you see Egypt and the other Arab nations tend to describe, the respondents tend to describe themselves as invariant. I must always be the same person. I'm very proud. I'm very consistent across situations. Very religious. And you see exactly the opposite thing in East Asia. That's another extreme. Highest percentages of atheists, humble people. You have to be small, you have to be humble, you have to be adaptable, you have to be flexible. And Eastern and Western Europe also tend to gravitate in this direction. The US is somewhere in the middle. It's far more religious than Europe, you know, and religious Americans value consistency and pride and integrity, and you have to be the same person in those situations. And there's another, I'm not going to talk about this, another contrast, happiness and trusting versus unhappiness. That's a different story. Now, I have come up with this idea based on a lot of psychological studies which show differences between Americans and East Asians. But it turns out that Arabs are a more extreme case on this. These are differences in what Professor Hofstede yesterday called self-enhancement versus self-effacement. These are terms from cross-cultural psychology. But because people don't understand these terms, I decided to use other terms that are not more understandable, actually. Monumentalism versus flexibility. But I think that this gives a better metaphor. There are nations, societies, in which the human self is like a big and proud monument. You know, I'm big and I'm proud of myself like a monument. And this is very important. I'm made of the same stuff outside and inside, and I'm very consistent. You know, that's the case in the States, but also in the Arab countries, in Pakistan. As opposed to, I'm a small chameleon. You know, I'm humble and I adapt to the situation. I adapt to the situation. And this is very important. Outside and inside, I may not be the same person. If any of you is familiar with studies of Japanese culture, you may have heard of this concept, honne and tatemai. One is the facade that you show to people. The other one is your real self. For example, in Japan and China, it's perfectly acceptable to be hopping mad, but to smile. You don't show your anger. You know, you pretend that you're happy. Nothing has happened. In the Arab world, this is ultimate hypocrisy. I've discussed this with Arabs. When you're angry, you don't always, I mean, they know how to control their feelings, of course, but you don't say anything. You know, there's no such thing as you smile and you, inside you're boiling, but you smile. You try to show the opposite feeling. Just like this monument that is made of bronze outside and inside, you're also one and the same person, outside and inside. But at the other extreme, in East Asia, it's perfectly okay to hide your feelings and pretend that you're something else. Now, this is one illustration of a monumentalist culture. You can probably guess where this comes from. In monumentalist cultures, like the land of the free and the home of the brave, there's an obsession with national heroes. National heroes are a big thing. It's national pride. If you haven't noticed this, the next time you listen to a speech by an American, there's a 99% chance that you will hear, "I'm very proud to be here, I'm very proud." They're always very proud of something. Yeah. Always very proud. In the past couple of years, I've been in the Netherlands maybe 6-7 times. And even before I traveled to the Netherlands, I haven't managed to learn any national heroes. They probably have national heroes, but you don't see them in the Netherlands. There's no such thing. If they have any national heroes, they know about them, but there's not such an obsession with national heroes. In Turkey, before the current government, the current government doesn't like Atatürk because he's seen as secular, and the current government is a little bit Islamist. But a couple of years ago, you would see Atatürk everywhere. National hero and obsession with Atatürk. And you can bet that in a culture with such obsession with nationalism and national pride, there's also religiousness. National pride and other types of pride correlate strongly with religiousness. This is something you would never see anywhere in Europe. Whole stadiums of people chanting Jesus is Savior, Jesus is Lord, and this is a typical American thing. But of course, the United States is not nearly as religious as the Arab nations. The most religious nations in the world are Egypt, Pakistan, Jordan is also close, and the least religious are the East Asian nations and some European nations, France and the Netherlands. The religiousness is very low. Now, these are two extremes. As I said, there is such a thing as social polarization in the Arab world. So this is not a picture that is representative of Arabs. And by the way, in some country, in Tunisia, where I live, I spent my adolescence there, and I've been there a couple of times since then. You'll probably never see this. You'll never see this. This was strongly suppressed by the government. They had an almost communist government in this respect. Religion was strongly suppressed by the previous government. In Tunis, the capital, I was there 2 years ago for the last time, and I tried to count the number of women who cover their heads. The percentage of it's probably no more than 10%. It's less than in Istanbul, by the way. But in Egypt, I haven't been in Egypt. I understand that this is quite. In Morocco, I spent a couple of weeks in Morocco some time ago, and it's not the norm, absolutely not. But you see such women. And the interesting thing is that the requirement is if you're like this in Egypt, you have to look like this also in London and in Paris. You don't change. And in the other extreme, again, you shouldn't expect all Japanese to be like this, but there's an obsession with accepting a European identity. And in China and the other Chinese, the Chinese in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, it's so strong that they have even adopted English names. So they're called Steve Shu and Albert Ng, and in China, in continental China, they usually have two names. They have a Chinese names for interactions with Chinese, but for interactions with Europeans, they have English names. My first contact with Chinese culture, I walked with my family into a hotel in downtown Beijing, and it was a nice hotel. We were greeted by somebody at the entrance. You see a Chinese-looking girl, and here it said Debbie. She's Debbie. And my wife is familiar with this, and she looks, oh, of course, Debbie, what else would a Chinese be called? It's a typical Chinese name, she's Debbie. There's this obsession with acceptance of everything that comes from Europe and the United States. They have, by the way, are you familiar with this strange thing? They have Oktoberfest. In all big Chinese cities, like, they have Oktoberfest. And they dress like Bavarians. They have Oktoberfest. I wondered if they have Halloween. And I asked Michael Bond, the person who found the fifth dimension. He's lived in Hong Kong for some 30 years. Do the Hong Kong people celebrate Halloween? I would think so, because it's becoming a big thing in Bulgaria. In this respect, we resemble a little bit Chinese culture. This obsession with becoming Western. Halloween is a big thing now with kids, and all over Sofia. You see pumpkins and kids dressed like vampires, and he said no. No, there's no Halloween in Hong Kong. And I wondered why. Aha. So this is a word of advice. You should never make assumptions. You never know. First of all, there's another characteristic that has nothing to do with this. The Chinese are quite introverted. So the idea of knocking on the doors of people you don't know, it doesn't go over well. Second thing is, what do you do in Halloween? You ask for treats. Oh, treats, money. No, that's not a Chinese thing. You don't ask people to give you treats and money. So you never know. But whatever does not go against the roots of Chinese culture, they accept it. And this is a picture that I took in Beijing, and I could have taken a lot of these. And it's very typical, you see. See, we are Europeans, and they have whole streets that sell these European bride gowns and Chinese traditions being replaced with European traditions. Now, it seems that this is a very old thing in Asia, and also in the Middle East. If you look at traditional Arab culture, if you go in the history of Arab culture, have you noticed that they never had theatrical performances? There are some historical records which show that despite the sophistication of Arab culture in the Middle Ages, they had medicine, they had poetry. When they discovered that the Europeans had theatrical performances, they were scandalized. What is going on? What is this? Why? Because in theater, you impersonate somebody else, which goes against the core of Arab culture. You have to be yourself. What is the strange thing? You're pretending you're somebody else. Why is alcohol forbidden? Because when you get drunk, you become somebody else. It's very unnatural. You have always to be the same person. I noticed, I've lived 4 years in Tunisia, and I noticed that then I asked my father, who's lived 12 years in different Arab countries, have you ever seen masks in Arab culture? And I've asked Arabs, and I have Afghani students. It's very similar culture. Do you have this tradition, masks? No such thing as masks. I mean, Bedouins cover their faces, but there's no such thing as putting on a mask which impersonates. Again, the mask is, you become somebody else. It's very strange. To traditional Arab culture, this is a strange concept to become somebody else. And the Quran is very explicit in this respect. There is a passage in which it says, actually the Quran is quite tolerant. It makes of Christian and Jewish religion. There are many references to Christianity and Judaism, and it says that Jews and Christians made a contract with Allah, but some of them have violated this. Some of them have violated this contract. So in principle, Jews and Christians are not bad people. They also follow the right. They tend to follow the right path, but some of them deviate. But as for this nonsense, this Christian nonsense, that God has 3 faces, Son, Father, and Holy Spirit. If you believe in this, you go straight to hell, because Allah can only be one. Just like people, as a person, you must be only one. Allah cannot have 3 faces. This is ultimate apostasy. To believe that God can be different and inconsistent. Only one face. If you believe this, you go straight to hell. But millennia ago in Asia, you see a different tradition. You see that one and the same God in Indian tradition can have different faces, which explains why they accept different religions so easily. They accept everything. God is one, but he has many personifications. Jesus Christ is okay, Krishna, Buddha, all these are personifications of the same God. This is okay. It's perfectly okay for God to be one in many. If you want to read more, this is one of the books that came out recently, published by Emerald, Cultural Differences in a Globalizing World. You see my name, forward by Herr Krośnie, and I'm very indebted to him for this support, because I found that when you are an East European, unless you're a celebrity, but I can't think of any East European celebrities, and I haven't become one yet. We have to be an international celebrity to get a book accepted for publication. If it hadn't been for his support, Emerald wouldn't have even responded. But when he gave the book his support, they agreed to publish it. And then there's another one to which he made a very substantial contribution, and I consider him a co-author, although I don't hold him responsible for anything that he doesn't agree with, in case he doesn't agree with something. But because he's a humble Dutchman, he decided not to be. He kept saying that my contribution is not significant enough. It's your book, but he made some substantial contributions. So it's by Michael Minkov with, I would say, substantial contributions by Gert Hofstede and substantial support. Again, he convinced Sage to publish this book. I would recommend this one to doctoral students who are interested in methodology, because this is not bedtime reading. This one is methodology. There are interesting things about cultures, but it's more difficult to read. Strange thing is that this book is selling better than the previous one. The other one is selling, but this one is more expensive. It's probably more boring, but it's selling unbelievably well. I thought that Sage was making a very bad gamble publishing this book. I thought that it would sell 200 copies in its entire shelf life. It's been out for about a year. It has sold more than 1,000 copies so far, and it's still selling, and selling even better. So I don't know. I don't understand marketing. Okay, it's time for questions. We have some time in case you have any questions. I hope I managed to challenge you.
All right. Now the floor is open to questions. Please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Professor Minkov. As a social anthropologist, I feel somehow called to answer some of the things you've mentioned. About the Marxist interpretation of cultural differences, have you tried looking at it from the gender point of view, for instance?
Can you elaborate a little?
Yeah, because of course many things can be as you brought to a common denominator in economic terms, right? Because it's easy to compare. But if you apply a different dimension, for instance, the cultures of the Arab countries and South American countries, it is okay for men to show emotion, something which in many other cultures is associated with women, strictly women, right? So this may be an interesting area to explore. I wouldn't be so sure about dividing societies into pastoralists and prop drawers and drawing such far-reaching conclusions about it, because this is not exactly the purpose of description. Actually, in anthropology, we use it for description more than for comparison, right? So
Yeah, there is such a thing as cross-cultural anthropology, created by George Murdoch, and they look exactly for associations between type of economy and social phenomena like murder. It turns out, for example, that horticulture predicts higher murder rates. The highest murder rates are in horticulturalist societies for different reasons.
That's violence. Yeah.
So yeah,
That's violence.
yeah.
And then maybe another dimension that might be worthwhile here for cultural analysis: the cultures of cooperation and competition.
Yeah. In principle, it depends on how you measure it. So always one of the lessons that I try to teach in this book is that you should always specify, when you say cooperation, innovation, whatever you say, you should always specify how you measure it. This is known as operationalism. And operationalism was pronounced dead by some anthropologists like Geertz, who believed in Geertz. It's pronounced Geertz. I think Americans pronounce it Geertz. He was an ideographer, which means that he didn't believe in statistics and statistical comparisons. So he pronounced operationalism dead, but it's not dead at all. And nowadays we're having very serious issues because some people don't understand operationalism. For example, some of the Hofstede dimensions seem to be different from from the Project Globe dimensions, even though they bear the same name. It turns out that they measure different things. The World Value Survey measures competitiveness in a particular way. They ask, do you approve of competition between people, or do you think that it brings out the worst in people? And you see that the most competitive nations are the monumentalist nations. The Arab nations, Latin Americans, they embrace competition. They say competition is okay. The least competitive nations are West European and America, by the way. And America. In America, the degree of approval of competition is quite low. Perhaps not as low in the Netherlands and in Scandinavia, but much, much lower than in the Arab world and Latin America and so on. So it has to do with wealth. Rich people see no purpose in, no point in competing with others because they have enough resources. But it's not the only thing. You can think of differences in monumentalism, flexibility. You can think differences in masculinity, femininity. It's probably quite complex. But it all depends on what you mean by competition and how you measure it.
Okay, further questions?
Well, regarding to your presentation and the presentation by Professor Hofstede yesterday, I noticed that Eastern Europe tends to come in the middle of all the diagrams. So it's kind of easier to discuss the extremes, but what about those countries which tend to come in the middle? And at the same time, thinking about the Polish culture, we have a saying that where there are two poles, there are three opinions, which implies that there is competition and polarization even within this country. So would you have anything to say about this part of the world?
I have something to say about this method of studying culture. It is criticized in this book. Never believe proverbs. Never believe proverbs. In Bulgarian, I give an example. We have a proverb that says, work makes people beautiful and laziness makes them ugly. Now we have another proverb that says, there's nothing you can gain from work except a hump on your back. What does this teach you about Bulgarian culture? Are we schizophrenic or what? So proverbs may not mean anything. So forget about proverbs. I've seen analyses of Chinese proverbs. Oh, we have these proverbs in China, which means that our culture is such and such and such. Maybe not. Maybe not. There's such a thing as national auto-stereotypes, which have been found to contain a lot of noise. Sometimes people have a correct image of the values of their nations. Sometimes they have extremely distorted images. What they say about their nations should not be trusted because they don't know. They're not sociologists or psychologists. So the fact that you have such a proverb in Polish means nothing. You have to measure.
It's not just a proverb, it's the facts.
I have to see a study, and it better be a comparative study to see that Polish culture is really more polarized than another culture, and then I will believe it. I'm a scientist. I believe in data, only not in hearsay about cultures.
You talk about social polarization. Just thinking about political systems. The U.S. at the moment is so socially polarized between Democrats and Republicans. In your research, do you have some sort of suggestions about how the social polarization could be dealt with to make communities and societies more cooperative?
What I know that in this article, 2008, I almost predicted what would happen in the Arab world. I wrote, you can see this was published 2008. I didn't predict the revolutions and exactly what is going on in the civil wars, but it says exactly, I quote, this doesn't bode well for the Arab nations. This polarization for Arab democracy, it doesn't bode well. Because as long as they have dictators, dictators can maintain social peace. Because if you have an iron hand, it can maintain social peace. The moment, we see this all over the Arab world. It started in Algeria some 10, 12 years ago. They experimented with democracy. It was a total disaster. total disaster. 120,000 people were killed as a consequence of their toying with democracy. We see this in Iraq. We see this in Egypt. Tunisia, there may be some hope in Tunisia. I'm not so sure, but it seems that they're a little bit different. As long as you depose the dictator, you see chaos in the country. They're unable, because they still have a clan system. They have a clan system. There's also this polarization between, not everybody in the Arab world is illiterate and uneducated. They have very sophisticated intelligentsias, and we have to recognize this. In Tunisia, for example, it's amazing. All intellectuals speak French almost like a native language. Now they all speak fluent English. They also speak literary Arabic, which is quite different from the vernacular. So they have degrees from Harvard and Princeton and all over the world, and they want to become modern. This was the official agenda of their dictator, by the way. Tunisia must become a European country, and he tried to suppress religion. And so, how do you deal with this? I think, with all due respect to Tony Blair, who said some time ago that he thought this was an idiotic statement to say that democracy doesn't work all over the world. I would say that his belief in democracy all over the world is completely idiotic, because we see that you cannot have democracy. I mean, British democracy started with King John. You know, when was it, 12th century? Yeah. So how can you compare the history of Britain, 8 centuries of experiments with democracy with a couple of years of experiments in Russia and in the Arab world? It takes hundreds of years, So my recipe would be a strong dictatorship until not everybody, but sizable percentages of the population are educated. Then you can have democracy. You cannot have democracy in countries where 20-30% of the population are illiterate. They follow their leaders blindly. They follow their clan leaders, not necessarily the leader of the country like Gaddafi, but they do what the clan leader says. If the clan leader says Gaddafi is an idiot, let's go and depose him and hang him, they will follow. If the clan leader says commit suicide, they will commit suicide. Until you have this, the prospects are very bad. In the U.S., this polarization is not so bad because it's a relatively well-educated nation. It's very rich, so it works. But when you combine poverty, low education, democracy cannot work. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Egypt. The Palestinians, they will probably kill each other. Hamas and Fatah, if you put them together, they will probably kill each other. Nothing will happen. So I'm sorry, but dictatorship seems to be the answer.
Where are you traveling and what do you sightseeing?
Sorry, what do I?
Where do you travel and what do you sightseeing?
What kind of sightseeing do I do?
Yes.
Well.
Relaxing question.
I like nature, and I think that I've seen all kinds of beautiful nature, from Iguazu in Brazil to Indonesia and nice beaches in Thailand. So I've been from Latin America to Southeast Asia and China and South Africa, and I like nature. I like architecture, all kinds of beautiful old architecture, and I like cultures. I like Indonesian and Thai dances and Balinese rituals and everything associated with culture. Wherever I go, I try to see nice nature, of course, in architecture, but I also try to learn something about the local culture. As long as it's visible. Not everything is visible. Some things are.
Any further questions? I had one question concerning this table about religions. The happiness and unhappiness and this sort of rigidity. Well, I mean, if you had that, I found that very interesting. But what my question actually was, it's religion seems to be a single concept, yeah, and I sort of remembered of of a book written by my fellow humor scholar John Morial about religion, and he made a distinction, a controversial distinction, between religions which tend to be happy and religions which tend to be sad. Yeah? So, very broad distinction, but nonetheless there are differences, right? With regard to happiness, with regard to flexibility or adaptability, or the sense of constraint and so on. So, I'm not sure what you think.
Studies of the relationship between religion and happiness are quite old at the individual level. In the United States, of course, they were initiated. I'm not sure if they were initiated, but perhaps the largest database comes from the United States. Ed Diener is universally recognized as the leading researcher in terms of individual happiness and the determinants of individual happiness. And he's also done quite a lot of cross-cultural studies in terms of happiness and life satisfaction, whether the happiness and life satisfaction is one and the same thing or not, and what determines it, and so on. And he has an interesting website. You can read a lot of stuff, and most of his publications are freely available on his website, Ed Diener. From there, you can find also other research and so on. Now, he finds that the relationship between religiousness at the individual level and happiness is unconvincing. If there is some relationship, it's quite weak. And it's quite clear because some of the happiest nations are the Scandinavian nations, and they are also the most secular, least religious. So you don't need to be religious at all to be happy. Vice versa, Arabs are the most religious, and they're some of the unhappiest nations, together with East Europeans. Some of the unhappiest. So religion does not necessarily give you happiness. Some people say I'm happy because of my religion, but many people are not. Religion can also make you anxious. Martin Luther, in some of his writings, admitted that he was extremely neurotic throughout his life about this issue. Will I be saved or not? He was trembling all the time about the uncertainty of salvation. He was a devout Christian, but it didn't make him happy because he didn't know whether he would be saved. So religiousness and happiness do not correlate well. And by the way, happiness does not predict suicide at the national level. At the national level, suicide correlates with this. Lowest suicide levels, where people are proud and they feel great and on top of the world, versus highest suicide rates here in Japan, actually in Russia and the Baltics and Ukraine, but they also have this culture of humility, and I experienced this here, with the Estonians here. Each time I say something, I've heard very nice things about Estonia, immediately, it's not. You're not allowed to. Yesterday we talked about self-criticism. These are the self-critical cultures. In Japan, nothing is very good. You don't accept compliments. You make a compliment to a Japanese or a Bulgarian, the reaction, I'm not so good. But, a friend of mine 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, a friend of mine had an American girlfriend and they got married. She had lived in Bulgaria for some time, learned Bulgarian well. And one day she asked me, Misho, I've noticed something strange with Bulgarian culture. Why is it that when you make a compliment to a Bulgarian, the Bulgarians don't accept it? The answer is, and I said, what do you do in America? You say, thank you. Of course, you accept it. It's a very natural thing. And they also reinforce each other with, it's a very typical thing. Americans will come and say, great job, fantastic, And once I heard Professor Hofstede say that he's never been congratulated by Dutch students. Is this still the case? Because Dutch students never come and say great job. Americans do. Say great job, Professor Hofstede, but so it's a culture where people reinforce their own ego, but also each other's egos, that they're great. In this type of culture, suicide is relatively low. But in cultures where people constantly criticize each other and put each other down, and there isn't much social support as well. It's quite complex.
I'm just wondering about the fact that religious is in one place here, right? Rather than related with invariance, proud and consistent, rather than perhaps also others. Is that the only place that religion can be associated with?
It's related mostly the closest associations, and there are some new studies by other analysts that show that, and these are, by the way, the cultural differences that account for the greatest and most important cultural differences. Differences in religiousness. I recently reviewed a paper by it was not double-blind. It was, so I know the names of the authors. They don't know that I'm reviewing the paper, but I know their names. That's how the journal works. They found that it's a big study, international team of scholars studying all kinds of things across the world. They found that the biggest and most important differences are in terms of religiousness and ethnocentrism, which they call also religiousness. It's another form of religiousness. Being blinded by your national pride and sense of national greatness is a form of religion. It is a religion, national pride. And the two are very strongly correlated, and they account for the greatest, strongest national differences. And the second one is individualism, collectivism. But this is number one, difference in religiousness. And they invite scholars to pay very special attention to this and to focus on this in the future. Differences in religiousness and ethnocentrism, which is basically this dimension of monumentalism versus flexibility.
Yes. Right. Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
presentation.